The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to focus on the ways that foreign oligarchs can invest in U.S.-based assets to hide or launder illicit funds. And, I know the vast majority, and majority of foreign nationals investing in the U.S. are legitimate. And there's no national concern whatsoever in that regard. But however, we know that there's been an incredibly, easy way to establish anonymous trusts, shell companies in the United States, which has made it easier for sanctioned citizens, and we saw it recently actually, and entities to hide their assets in the United States. I know both the administration, the current one and the previous one, has supported, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Corporate Transparency Act of 2020, which is intended to prevent that kind of abuse of, these shell companies like the one used to hide ownership and control of U.S.-based real estate purchases that are sanctioned by, folks that are Chinese nationals, Russian nationals, a number of folks, again, they're sanctioned. So it's something for the whole witness panel here. How important is it for the U.S. and allied nations to adopt transparency measures like beneficial ownership registries to prevent bad actors from abusing our open financial systems? Because it is really about those resources and the money, as you all know. So I can start with whoever would like to begin. I think, Eric, you had your hand up.
I'm happy to take this one. I appreciate the question. The short answer is it's incredibly important. You've seen even recently in publicly announced actions, instances where sanctioned Russian oligarchs, for example, were able to park billions of dollars in trusts that were registered in Delaware for a period of, 5 or 6 years. So the Corporate Transparency Act and the related legislation, were great work done by this Congress, are important steps.
Eric, for my residents, explain why, because this is the danger that I think is not understanding. It's like, oh yeah, they're just moving money for benefit of their own, but it's actually a huge concern because this is how they can fund.
Sure, yeah, exactly. So for example, pre-Corporate Transparency Act, an individual could go to a state, form a corporation, and then not be required to submit the natural persons who were the owners or the controllers of that corporation. So in theory, a Russian oligarch could go to a US state, form a corporation in somebody else's name, there would be no verification component, and they could subsequently funnel money through that shell company into US assets, and it may be very, very difficult to detect. That was the issue that the Corporate Transparency Act at a high level was trying to solve. It's being implemented as we speak, so Treasury is rolling out a series of rules to implement it, but that's the sort of core challenge.
Yeah. Anybody else? Mr. Hara?
I agree very much with Eric that the Corporate Transparency Act was a huge first step. Obviously something like that, and Treasury Department is in the process of getting IT and rolling out rules to uncover the beneficial owners of millions of companies. That's a big endeavor, and they need to make sure they have the resources to do it. I do think if Congress wants to continue looking at this issue, and I would encourage Congress to do so, looking at greater transparency around some of the enablers of corporate corporate secrecy, the lawyers and the accountants. I think that's another good area to push on. And then the other thing I would say,
because there are firms that are actually helping them do it, correct? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is I think we have to get much more serious about transparency in some of the small tax havens. A few years ago when this Congress was worried about the fact that overseas banks were helping wealthy Americans hide their taxes, there was a very meaningful effort to force banks in Switzerland and the Caymans and places like that to provide tax reporting information to the U.S. There's not really a parallel requirement or serious effort to get, places like the BVI and the Caymans to clean up their corporate ownership structures. And I think it's time to look at what could be done there.
No, thank you. And I just would, for many of my colleagues here, especially my Democratic colleagues have known that I've spoken about recently, just the impact of seeing somebody like Vincent Chen in our community in Detroit beaten to death after anti-Asian hate rhetoric was increasing during that time, and we're seeing that again. So I just hope this committee, we can do this important work without fueling that rhetoric, being very, I think, thoughtful, so that we can do meaningful work, again, without jeopardizing our Asian neighbors across the country. But with that, I yield.